17,000 Puritans migrated to New England in 1636. There were some pastors already at that time, but they needed to train some new pastors. So a school was started in that same year, 1636, and several years later, a pastor donated half of his estate and 400 books from his library to help this new school starting to train pastors. The school was then named after that man and continued training ministers. Its early motto was Truth for Christ and the Church. That was its slogan, Truth for Christ and the Church. In those early years, half of the graduates went on to become ministers. 10 of the first 12 presidents were all pastors that led the school. It was a school started to train pastors, led by pastors, and placed pastors in local churches to share the gospel. But in 1701, one of those pastor presidents ended his term, and it marked the start of a long struggle between historical Christianity and what was known then as liberalism. Throughout the 1700s, ideas from the Enlightenment, the power of reason, free will, and other liberal theologies began to clash with the traditional Christian doctrine the school had always taught. One of their presidents in 1869, according to a historian, that president eliminated the favored position of Christianity from the curriculum while opening it up to student self-direction, according to him. This historian says that president was motivated not by a desire to secularize education, but by a transcendentalist Unitarian conviction, which was liberal theology. These convictions were focused on the dignity and worth of human nature, meaning that humans aren't inherently sinful, they're good. The right and ability for each person to perceive truth, meaning the Bible's not the truth, we get to decide it on our own. And the indwelling of God in each person, meaning God is not a specific person we worship, he's kind of all around us and in us. That university that I've described for you is Harvard University, started all those years ago. Once created to train pastors for ministry, now it no longer resembles that desire. And when you go to their website and you search their history, I printed off 13 pages of history of what none of this was even in there. They completely ignore it and don't even state it. I had to find a third party that actually gave the true original history of Harvard. Now, they still have a divinity school, but most people will note that a lot of those people that even attend that divinity school aren't even Christians. The Bible is just a text that they study as secular people. They're not believers, they're not Christians even in the slightest sense. And there's other stories I could share with you about. Yale University has a similar story, and other schools. And the thing that I want to point out for us is that over time, they drifted from the truth of the gospel. What they started out doing to provide truth for Christ and the church eventually drifted away. And I wanted to share that with you because most of us are maybe a decision or two away from starting to drift from the truth. We're a friend or two away, or we're a year or two away, or a marriage away from drifting from the truth. And Paul tells us that some people in this passage have drifted from the truth that we looked at a little bit ago. In the past week, we looked at God and what he did for the Galatians last week in the first 11 verses of chapter 4. It was clear that God had done something for these Galatians. God the Father, the Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit were mentioned 9 times in those 11 verses. It was a clear doctrinal lecture Paul was giving to those Galatians that we looked at last week. But here, in the passage that Judy read for us, in these 9 verses, Paul addresses them saying you or your 20 different times. He's talking directly to them. He also shares from his personal experience, saying I, me, or my 14 times in these 9 verses that we're going to look at together. And as we go through it together, we see that he starts out with this plea that he begins with in verse 12. Paul appeals to the Galatians to live free from the law. He says, I beg of you, brethren, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. His plea is based on this personal relationship with the Galatians that he has. He calls them brethren here at the beginning of verse 12. The NIV translation, or NLT, says brothers and sisters, and the New Revised Standard Version even calls them friends, which I really like. He personally knew these people, and he loved them, and he pleads for them to come back to the truth. And the plea was for the Galatians to become like him, free from the law, just as he says here. In Galatians, we've learned that Paul says he has died to the law, that he's no longer under the law. He left that life in Judaism of following the law. In other words, the Galatians should become like Paul and be free from the law and not tied to it. And it's a good reminder, the Galatians never were tied to the law because they weren't Jews. They were pagan Gentiles before he came and shared the gospel with them. So this is Paul's plea to them at the very beginning in verse 12. He loves them and wants what's best for them, and he then moves on to compliment the Galatians for the good things that they have done. In verses 12 through 15, he talks about their past and how the Galatians have lived free from the law in the past and enjoyed freedom through Christ. And it starts there at the very end of verse 12, where he says, "You have done me no wrong." Verse 13, "But you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. And that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition, you did not despise or loathe, but you received me as an angel of God, as Jesus Christ himself. Where then is that sense of blessing you had? For I bear you witness that if possible, you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me." Now the first point he makes it here is that the bodily illness that he had was the reason the Galatians got to hear the gospel. There in verse 13 it says, "It was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time." So now Paul was either sick and then he went to Galatia, or he arrived in Galatia and got sick shortly after. We're not quite sure, but whatever timeline it might be, it makes it clear it was because of the unfortunate health problems that the Galatians got saved and were able to hear the gospel. And this reminds us that sometimes good can come out of the struggles in life that we face. We might face divorce, financial hardships, sickness, job struggles, or abandonment from family. But through those things, God sometimes gives us a way to minister to others that we would not have had if we didn't go through those things. And I'm going to read a little bit of what I wrote here, just because I want to be super clear and make sure I don't misspeak. He said, "And now, I'm not saying that God gives us those things so that we can minister to others. I don't think he decides you need to be laid off from your job so you can minister to other people that have been laid off from our jobs. I don't think God does things that way. But I do think he decides, I do think that through his sovereignty, sometimes he orchestrates things so that our paths cross with the paths of others that need encouragement and ministry that we can offer to them. And that ministry could only occur because of the difficulties we've gone through. And in the case of Paul, the Galatians were able to hear the gospel and get saved because of Paul's physical illness. But what was this bodily illness that he talks about here? It was clearly physical and outward, because the text says it was a bodily condition in verses 13 and 14. We also know it was physical because he references how the Galatians would have plucked out their eyes to help him. So it wasn't a mental disability, it was something outward and physical that could be seen by others. And this bodily illness that's described here in verses 13 and 14 is the same thorn in the flesh that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12. And likely it's some reference to a persistent, severe physical condition that he was struggling with. What was it specifically? We don't really know. If it was important, God would have told us. But what is important is that because of this physical condition Paul had, the Galatians got to hear the gospel. When I shared this with my wife, she said, maybe God didn't tell us what the physical condition was, so that we each could insert our own struggle in there as a way to relate to Paul. I thought that made a lot of sense. So how would these Galatians treat Paul, someone that looked different and acted different than them? Here we get to read about that. Whatever the problem was, it was a trial to the Galatians. There in verse 14, it says it was a trial to them. There was something in Paul's physical condition that tempted the Galatians to reject him. It wasn't easy for the Galatians to accept him because of the way he looked or the requirements that his conditions placed on them. But we read about their response in verse 14, that they treated Paul in a loving way, as brothers and sisters in Christ should. At the end of verse 12, he kind of alludes to this. He says, "You have done me no wrong." This describes a time when Paul first met them and preached the gospel to them. And in verse 14, we learn how they did not respond to him. In verse 14, it says, "You did not despise or loathe me." And the Greek word for loathe there could be translated spit out, and that relates to the culture they were in, because if you saw someone that was really sick and you wanted to show them stay away, you would spit at them as a way to kind of signal, keep your distance. It was a common way that they would interact with invalids and epileptics at that time, and that's the same word for loathe here. But the Galatians didn't do this. They didn't respond to Paul in that way. They did respond to him, if you notice there in verse 14, "You did not despise or loathe, but," notice it starts with but. It would have been easy or even expected to reject Paul. "But you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself." So in other words, they loved him like they would have loved Christ. Could there be any higher compliment he could have given them? Probably not. Despite Paul's illness and his repulsive appearance, they accepted him as one of their own. And they didn't just accept him, they also accepted his message that he preached to them. So they loved him like he was Christ. They also helped him drastically. Down in verse 15 it says, "You would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me." Here Paul wants to stress the extent to which they were trying and willing to help Paul. Now that was a common expression of that time, of being willing to do anything to help someone, that he uses here. So it could have been that he had eye trouble, but this was a way that people would express they were willing to help anyone that needed it, was by plucking out their eyes. They wouldn't literally do that, of course. That was just a figure of speech they would use. But what Paul's trying to tell us here is that they were willing to give him almost anything to help them. In 2014, my wife and I were living in Texas and our apartment burned down. I was inside the building when the apartment caught on fire, and so someone from church heard about it and he came over to the new place we were staying at. And this was in the end of November in Texas, North Texas, where it gets pretty cold. And the guy from our church shows up and he sees me just in jeans and a shirt. He's like, "Dude, it's cold, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Dude, our apartment just burnt down. I don't have any clothes." And so he took off this big jacket he had and he just said, "Here, take my jacket." Like, he just gave me his jacket to help. That's the way that he helped me drastically, and these Galatians were willing to help Paul drastically in that way. So they loved Paul like he was Christ. They helped him drastically, and they also blessed him. In verse 15, he starts out by asking this question: where then is that blessing? Where then is that sense of blessing you had? And that was a blessing based on their relationship. They had done good to Paul. It was a blessing to him and made him happy. And so these verses here, they're past, and how they've interacted with Paul is a reminder that we should accommodate, accept, and greatly help those that don't look like us or might even repulse us when we see them. But the focus changes here from verses 12 to 15 from the reception the Galatians gave to Paul when he showed up, and it starts to talk about how they are acting in their present situation and how they have drifted away from the gospel. And that present situation is described in verses 16 through 18, where he writes, "So have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? They eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will seek them. But it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you." So Paul and the Galatians once were friends, but now they are foes. And he's become a foe, he's become their enemy because of what he has taught. There in verse 16, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? This is a rhetorical question he asks in order to sum up the present situation and how they were clashing against each other. Paul was the enemy of the Galatians, once their friend, but now their foe. And speaking the truth sometimes creates enemies, even in our culture today. And the gospel, the truth of the gospel was what was at stake for them in their time. It's the reason Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians. He's trying to correct the truth of the gospel that had been distorted by those legalizers. And those legalizers, as we've talked about in the past, they had showed up after Paul had left and started to talk to the Galatian believers saying, oh, you've been saved by faith, but you also need to follow this Old Testament law. That's what the legalizers had done. They were adding things to the gospel and legalizing, adding to it things that didn't need to be there. And that's why Paul has become an enemy, because he's now trying to fight for the gospel and for the truth. It reminds me of J. Vernon McGee, the pastor that has the Through the Bible radio ministry. He's passed away now. But he talked about in his pulpit in all the years he preached, he always wanted to put a little phrase on the front. And he said he never had the nerve to do it. And it was this verse that he wanted to put right there. Am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? He said he always wanted to put that there because it's difficult sometimes to tell the truth. And he comments on this verse saying, as you know, many folk today really don't want the preacher to tell truth from the pulpit. They would much rather he would say something complimentary that would smooth their feathers and make them feel good. We all like to have our backs rubbed, and there is a lot of back rubbing from the contemporary pulpit rather than declaring the truth of God. And as your pastor, I want to preach the truth to you and present the truth to you. And that's one of the reasons I like to kind of go verse by verse through books of the Bible, because it forces me to take you through the verses and what does it really say? What does it mean? And explain it to you, and then give you ideas on how to apply it. Even though we come across sometimes difficult passages that's tough for me to preach from, it's good to have that accountability to preach the truth to you. So in verse 16, he talks about how he has become their enemy. And in verses 17 and 18, he shares who has made him their enemy and why he has become their enemy. He talks about how the legalizers were seeking the Galatians and shielding the Galatians from Paul. He says in verse 17 there, they eagerly seek you. They eagerly desired and wanted. The legalizers eagerly wanted the Galatians. And it's nice to be desired. It impresses us when someone wants to have a relationship with us and spend time with us, right? In verse 18 it says, but it is good always to be eagerly sought. And Paul even admits that. It's okay to feel compliments and flattery and people that want to get to know us. And in America, we have a lot that is seeking us, if you think about it. We've got beer commercials that tell us if you drink this beer, hot chicks will be all over you all the time, okay? We've got clothing companies and makeup companies that say if you wear these clothes or use these products, you'll look 29 years old forever, right? We've got traveling sports teams for kids where it used to be, basketball was a winter sport. Now there's spring basketball and summer league and all these leagues that seek the kids that say, well, we'll make them better players, and then they can get a scholarship, and then they can, be pro, and those things compete for our time. And we've even got TV, like sports on TV. We've got baseball, soccer, golf, tennis, poker, all of these things that they're always on, all the time, that we can continue watch. Those are all things seeking us. Even racing. Is that a sport? Maybe not. It reminds me of the NASCAR driver. He was a mediocre NASCAR driver. He got pulled over by a police officer, and he was a mediocre NASCAR driver. He finished in the middle of the pack, the end, every race. And so the police officer smells marijuana, so he gets the NASCAR driver out and he searches the car, and in that car of the mediocre NASCAR driver, he found every single drug except for speed. So. I couldn't resist that one, sorry. So we have all these things that are seeking us. But eventually, they can cause us to drift from God and from the gospel. And that's what happened here. These false teachers, the legalizers, were seeking the Galatians and drove a wedge between Paul and the Galatians. And it says that they were doing it with wrong motives. At the end of verse 17, it says they were doing this not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so you will seek them. The legalizers were shutting the Galatians out from Paul. And it's not that Paul didn't want to let other people do ministry with them. He says in verse 18, but it's good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am with you. So he wasn't saying that he has to be the only one to share the gospel with them or disciple them. He's saying they just need to do it in the right way and know the truth and have good motives. And next is Paul's direct appeal. While the legalizers didn't have a sincere love for the Galatians, Paul shows how he does have a sincere love for them next in verses 19 and 20. And we read about his practice here, his plan to get them back on the right track. Because the Galatians had gone backwards and they needed to be discipled again. So verse 19, he says, my children, with whom I am again in labor until Christ is formed in you. And he uses two metaphors in this verse. First one is that he's in labor giving birth. We see Paul's love and care for these people. He calls them my children here. And up in verse 12, he's already called them his brethren or his brothers and sisters or his friends. These are people that he knew and loved, but they're his children and they've gone backwards, so he is going to try to help them. He says that I'm with whom I am in labor. So he had been with them 1 year prior to this letter. He had shared the gospel with them. They got saved. But now he shares that it's been hurtful to him because he has to go through the process again. They've walked away from the truth. And by using a birth and labor metaphor, he's saying there's no more hurtful or painful experience that he has to go through than to have to give birth to them again. The second metaphor he gives here is that Christ is being formed inside of them. He says, until Christ is formed in you. Here Paul shares his commitment to them, and he basically tells us and reminds us that evangelism is not a substitute for discipleship. Paul here has been with them a short time. He shared the gospel and then he left and continued his travels. But that discipleship needed to continue. And now he says he's going to stick with them. He's not going to give up on them. He's going to work with them until Christ is formed inside of them. And that's a great example for us because we live in a culture of what have you done for me lately culture, right? You're there for me and now, and what have you done for me? And if you haven't done anything for me, then you can leave. But the Bible tells us something different. When we love people, we don't give up on them. We stick with them, and that's what Paul is doing here. And he says that he wishes to be present with them so he could continue to work with them. That's what he says in verse 20. He says, but I wish to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. Paul reminds us that we need to love people as much as we love the truth. He loved these Galatians and he wants to be with them, to talk with them. He was writing to them with a pen, but he wished he could be there to talk with his voice with them because he loved them. And it's a reminder to us that technology is never a substitute for that in-person interaction. Technology in Paul's time were these letters that they could write on papyrus and send, and even now with different technology, it's no substitute for actually meeting in person. If Paul had been with them for a longer period of time, those legalizers would not have been able to sneak in, deceive the Galatians, and fool them and get them to depart from the church. Paul could have protected them and shielded them in a way he couldn't have done while he was away from them. And it's a reminder for us, we can't be a godly influence on someone when we're far away, right? In our church, we have someone that's in a home right now being cared for, so she can't come here. So there's a group of ladies, they bring the Bible study to her and go meet with her, to meet in person. Because you can watch sermons online and things like that, but there's no substitute for actually meeting and talking in person like they're doing. So as we walk through the passage together, I think you've already seen some good ways to apply what Paul is telling these Galatians here. But there's 3 things I want to make sure that we don't miss. 3 applications. 1, we need to distinguish false teachers from truth tellers. Distinguish false teachers from truth tellers. And the Galatians had failed at this. The legalizers showed up and said, oh great, you've been saved by faith. There's also this law you need to follow. And the Galatians just walked right along following that law. The Galatians failed to recognize these false teachers that were taking them away from the truth of the gospel. And believers in our day are succumbing more and more to American, secular, cultural Christianity, as well as cults that are taking them away, because the church is becoming less and less literate about what the Bible says and about Christian doctrine. So sometimes these things take them away and help them drift away from the truth. For example, in American secular cultural Christianity, we have these things that get said that we know aren't true, like God helps those that help themselves. That's not in the Bible. Or the prosperity gospel, if you don't have enough money, just give more money to God and he'll give it right back. Or try it before you buy it. I love her, but I want to live with her and see if I really love her. Well, if you love her and you're committed to her, you make the decision, okay? Or God wants me to be happy, so I'm making this decision to make me happy. Those are things that kind of seep into our lives that, if we're not careful, can cause us to drift from the gospel. And even cults in America are growing. The recent studies that I've read have showed that church attendance is declining in America. Big surprise, we all know that. But the cults are actually growing. So Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Muslims are all growing faster than the population. The Buddhists have been growing at 5%, which is faster than the 1% population. But Wicca has grown 26%. Which is the fastest growing cult in America right now. They're all growing faster than the population is. And in Ron Rhodes' book, he has this book about Christian denominations, and at the back he talks about cults and why they are not part of the traditional church. And he says this that I've been carrying around for a while, trying to find a good context to share it in, and I think it makes sense here. He says, cults typically deny salvation by grace, thus distorting the purity of the gospel. The Mormons, for example, emphasize the necessity of becoming increasingly perfect in this life. The Jehovah's Witnesses emphasize the importance of distributing Watchtower literature door to door as part of their salvation. Hindu cults teach that one must become increasingly perfect in each successive lifetime through reincarnation. In keeping with the above, Ron Rhodes says, a common mark of the cults is they often use words from the Bible. Words like God, Jesus, sin, salvation, cross, resurrection, and ascension. But they redefine them to mean something entirely different from what the historic Christianity doctrine teaches. And that's why those cults are growing, is they have all these cultural Christians out there that don't really know the difference between a Mormon and a Christian, or a Jehovah's Witness and a Christian. And they can easily grow because people can drift from the truth because they don't know the truth. And we need to distinguish those false teachers from truth tellers by knowing the Bible. We need to know what it says by reading it, listening to it while we drive somewhere, listening to sermons, or being in small group Bible studies with other Christians. And also, most importantly, we still have truth tellers in our lives, people that know us, that are more spiritually mature in us, and they can help us grow, and we need to be receptive to those truth tellers. So we need to distinguish the false teachers, but also be receptive to those truth tellers that will help us grow in our faith. The second application is we need to develop a love for those that are different than you. Develop a love for those that are different than you. 2 decades ago, a black woman named Kalisha White applied for a team leader position at Target and worried her application got ignored because of her race. She was black. She didn't even get an interview. So she sent her resume back in with a distinctively white woman's name and removed a couple of her qualifications, to which she was very surprised that she suddenly got an interview there at Target. That was 20 years ago, so as a result, there was a lawsuit that occurred and companies changed the way they did things, right? So recently, some economists conducted a new study. 20 years later, we are sure we fixed this problem, right? What they did is they submitted 83,000 job applications to Fortune 500 companies. Half with traditionally white-sounding names and half with traditionally black-sounding names. Applicants with black names were called back 10% fewer times across the board. And even less in some specific companies, despite having comparable qualifications with their company. They're the same resumes, they just changed the names. The person doing this study says that the discrimination was concentrated in customer-facing industries, such as restaurants, retail, and clothing sectors, where the black person would actually have to talk to another person. Industries without customer-facing roles like jobs in freight or transportation showed the lowest discrimination levels against black names. Now, I don't think those people consciously decided that as they looked at those. It's just kind of how we're wired or raised sometimes. That's why we need to be active to develop a love for those that are different than us. But loving others that are different than us extends beyond just the color of your skin and my skin. Do we treat the opposite sex the same? Do I treat women the same as I treat other men? Do we treat educated people the same as uneducated people? Do we treat people with disabilities the same if we're healthy? And one thing that's made me really proud is my friend, Justin, that I talk to each week. He's a pastor in Nebraska of a church a little bit bigger than us. And they're in rural Nebraska, so this church building was built probably 100 years ago. And there's these enormous steps to get up into their building. They are deep and they are long. And there's like 8 of them to get up to their church. So if you can't get up the steps, you can't go to church. And so what he just had their church do is they spent $80,000 to install an elevator so that anybody that wants to go to their church can show up. And they live in a rural area that's very farm, so everybody there, most people there are laborers, but I thought that was a great example that they develop a love for people that are different than them that can still come there even if they can't walk up the steps. The third application is to disciple those you evangelize. Disciple those you evangelize. When we share the gospel and someone accepts the free gift of salvation, it's an exciting experience. We feel like mission accomplished has, I messed it up. We feel like mission impossible has become mission accomplished. But the mission isn't complete. In fact, the job has only just begun. After we've done evangelism, now we disciple that person. We love them, talk to them, pray with them, check in with them, have meals together, and spend time together encouraging them in their relationship and walking them through to maturity. One of my favorite ministries as a pastor was at my last church where I taught a Sunday school class for new believers. So the senior pastor would give a gospel invitation at the end of every single sermon. And if people accepted Christ, I would work with them to come to this class and keep an eye on them and love them and have them over to our house for dinner and things like that. And we worked hard with those people. We went every single Sunday. We started on time. We met the whole full hour that I could get them to be there. We didn't take a break for summer because the kids were out. We didn't take a day off. We met every single Sunday because I knew there's no substitute for evangelism. That discipleship means when you evangelize people, you disciple them. So as we wrap up our time together, that story I shared with you about Harvard is sad and breaks my heart. Remember that motto? Truth for Christ and for the church. That was the motto of Harvard. But they drifted from that truth. And the Galatians too drifted from the truth. And I pray that you don't drift from the truth. And as your pastor, I promise to do everything to keep you from drifting from the truth. And I hope likewise that you will help me stay loyal to God and not drift from the truth.